Hi, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live broadcast on the release of the ISM Report on Business. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm a senior writer and copy editor for Inside Supply Management, which is ISM's member publication. And welcome to our discussion as we break down the Services PMI data for July. Among the four key sub-indexes, there wasn't a whole lot of dramatic movement, but most of it was in the wrong direction, particularly on employment, which we'll certainly discuss today. And the prices index came dangerously close to a bad benchmark, which we'll also get into later, you can bet. But add it all up, and the PMI stayed in expansion, but just barely, registering 50.1%, a 0.7 percentage point decrease compared to the previous month. As usual, there's lots to talk about. And let's bring in Steve Miller, the chair of the ISM Services Business Survey Committee, who's joining us from Las Vegas. Fortunately for us, what he's going to tell us today will not stay there. But Steve, what stood out to you about the July numbers?
The big takeaway for me is the only reason we're still in positive territory is because supplier deliveries slowed down a bit. Got a 0.7% increase in supplier deliveries, and that's what kept us above 50. So not great numbers. Still, I mean, you got to celebrate. We're still in expansion territory, but it certainly looks like a slower growth, slower growth model than what we were expecting.
Yeah, obviously, the number came in below expectations. That was a topic of discussion in the markets today. I know we've mentioned in the time that you've been the chair, certainly the resiliency of the services sector. Another sobering month of manufacturing data, not just from ISM. And some of that sentiment picked up again that, services is kind of carrying the economy right now. I mean, is this just another example, even though that data came in a little bit, lower than expected? I mean, still expansion is expansion, even if just barely.
Yeah, what we saw, Dan, is we saw one industry move from flat to expansion. And we saw the other one that was flat last month move into contraction. So it does seem to be a 50-50 environment. The other slight negative there is that if you took the average of the PMIs for each industry above, in expansion territory and those in contraction territory, the averages of each also dropped. So it seems like there's positive momentum in some industries, but it's slowing down. So and anybody who's actually dealing with the kind of the tariff concerns or depends on lower interest rates, I think those two things could certainly slow down ordering, cause people to delay orders and commitments, and we're seeing that also in the employment numbers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you mentioned tariffs, and obviously that is a topic that is going to continue to be on everybody's mind. You had a quote in the report. I will quote it. The new exports, which had a 3.2 percentage point decrease in July, and the imports, a 5.8 point drop indexes, both moved from expansion to contraction, and that provided signals that tariff tensions are impacting global trade. Before I ask you to respond, I'll give our viewers the exact numbers. New export orders registered 47.9, down from 51.1 in June, and imports 45.9%, down from 51.7%. So that was pretty significant. Yeah, just elaborate, on some of the dynamics that those two indexes, showed, and as well as the overall tariff environment that continues to flummox supply managers, to say the least.
Yes. Is it 15? Is it 50? Is it 100? Is it 9? What is the number today? Being in Vegas, you go to the roulette wheel and maybe I can get some prediction as to what the tariff is going to be on China. The going back several months and looking at commentary, there was as far back as about, I believe it was 4 months ago, we started getting comments of people are delaying orders until they see what kind of tariff impact will impact the pricing. They're delaying longer term agreements, and some of the discussions I've had over the last month is also about increases in storage in duty-free zones, waiting until we get final answers on what's hoped to be lower ongoing tariff rates from some countries. That means that maybe that inventory spike and import spike that happened a couple of months or 3 months ago maybe is still sitting and reducing our overall import activity. And then things, anecdotally is the best that I can offer at the moment on the export side, as we see in Canada some reluctance to buy U.S. goods. That's going to impact our wholesaling and retailing as well as transportation. And then just ongoing trade tension. I can't imagine that it's, maybe not use a double negative. I imagine that in Europe, that's impacting exports for the U.S. based on the latest trade agreement, which didn't sit well with everyone.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we also talked about supplier deliveries, and it was 51%. That was an expansion, which indicates longer lead times, which, as we've explained, with how that index works, that's typical. As demand picks up and the economy improves a little bit, those supplier delivery times are going to get a little bit slower. You also talked about the backlog of orders index. That was at 44.3%, still in contraction territory, but up a little bit compared to June. With business activities and new orders remaining in expansion, that kind of could be a sign of demand stimulation. I know, you might be accused of taking positive signs wherever you can get them, but discuss why a combination of those indexes might not be a bad thing.
Yeah, up is always good, and above 50 is even better.
Yeah.
The new orders being at just over 50 and order backlog being below 45 is tough. The good news, if I need to stretch, is that maybe the prices index will get some collars around it, because the business activity is slowing down a bit. It's expanding, but not expanding as quickly, as well as the new orders not expanding as quickly. The thing that we'll see drive inflation is higher prices paid and higher business activity and higher new orders, because then the demand is continuing. So a little bit weakness in demand while prices are escalated probably isn't a bad dynamic from an overall inflationary perspective. That's the best. I think that's the best that I can dig out at the moment, other than 50.1 is above 50.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into the employment number, which drew a lot of attention today, as you might imagine. And especially in the last few days, amid a disappointing federal jobs report, along with some previous month's revisions that raised some eyebrows, and then the kerfluffle after that, to say the least. The employment index continued to slow in July, down to 46.4%. Among the companies surveyed, just to get a little bit more granular with that data, 18.1% reported headcount reductions. That was up from 13.1% in June. I mean, in the recent past, some observers have noted that our employment index does not necessarily, had not comported with other data and the federal report. And you explained, why that was. And, given the developments in the recent days, kind of update that a little bit and, kind of give us the picture.
Yeah. So historically speaking, this is what I've observed in the data, is that the numbers that we see in our employment index lead BLS by 1 to 2 months. It's either 1 month or 2 months, depending on how you look back at our reporting versus BLS. So I was surprised initially at seeing the strong BLS numbers in June. And then when you dug into it, it was private industry was anemic growth, and public and government hiring at the state and local level, I believe it was showing a significant increase. and then that got rationalized out this month. So my story last month is that because the public sector plays such a small part in the overall services industries, that the private industry, the low private industry growth was much more indicative of what we were seeing in the survey with the low employment number. Now that the public number is back to a very low number, I think there's a perfect alignment. The concern, though, Dan, that I would have is that when you look at employment numbers, I don't expect things to improve through the summer from a BLS perspective. We may see our employment index improve as the tariff issues get settled and people need to start making inventory again and buying product to fulfill orders. But from a BLS number standpoint, for those of us who track those, I wouldn't expect those to improve in August and potentially not even September.
Yeah. Yeah, we may elaborate that on a little bit later if we have time, because definitely some areas of concern. And, I might want to ask you, are there any particular industries that, are especially problematic at this point, if you have a chance to think about that while we're talking. But let's get into prices. That's another thing that has dominated conversation as well. And, the little a little math or a little stat, for those stat geeks who follow this, that the longest streak for any ISM report on business index in terms of, the trends and the direction that it's going, out of all three of our reports, manufacturing, services, and hospital, that streak, the longest one right now, belongs to the Services Prices Index. That's been an expansion or increasing territory for 98 months in a row. And in July, the reading of 69.9% was just under that 70% threshold that always raises eyebrows. But it was the 8th straight above 60% and the highest since October of 22, when it was above 70% at 70.7. Saw some prices relief a little bit, if you can call it that, in the manufacturing in July, but not here. Just discuss the lay of the land that the data and the comments told you.
Yeah, because the rate, the current interest rates and the current Fed rate has been such a discussion with our high prices paid numbers over the last several months, actually over the last 9 months. I was just kind of looking back at where did I see similar trends, at 10 to 11 point increase over that period of time, and a roughly general increase in terms of the trend. And where I found that was leading into our high inflation spike back in COVID times. So very similar curve, just adjusted by a few points down in terms of the overall curve for one period versus this period. What that says to me is, be careful about injecting money into the system, whether that's what were they called, tariff bonus checks, or significant rate cuts. I said on a call a little bit earlier today, if I were betting, and I'm not great at doing this, but if I were betting, I would bet on a 0.25% for the next rate cut. Nothing substantial, because there's too much risk that we reignite inflation, and inflation hurts everybody. But we probably need to do something to help the construction industry get home buying, that type of thing, and that's going to require some reductions in mortgage interest rates, and that won't happen unless the Fed rate goes down.
Yeah, you alluded to this in one of your earlier calls, and it raised an antenna for me, because when I was talking with Tom Derry, who filled in for Sue Spence in doing the manufacturing call the other day, he said something to the effect of, or we had talked about something to the effect of, yeah, markets can have fun, pricing in projected tariff increase or interest rate decreases or movement there. But I mean, if you're running a business, or if you're running purchasing operations for a business, I mean, you need to see it. You need to see it happen before you act on that. Working on assumptions is a very risky business, obviously. And I think you alluded to that earlier today when you were talking about, I believe it was construction on an earlier call. yeah, just allude on that. If yeah, markets can have fun with maybes, but if you're running a business or doing purchasing, that's a bad idea to operate on maybes. I mean, you need to see the Fed actually pull the trigger on that before you do anything.
Yeah, if you guess right, it's good. And often just depends on what industry you're in and how much competitive pressure there is, whether being out there first can help you, and then how much elasticity there is in your pricing. If you have excess product or excess supply in retail, how easily can you adjust? Because if you have, say, a mortgage rate, you're able to refinance, and now you're spending $1,000 a month or $500 less a month in your mortgage. You got money to spend at the store. You have money to spend at grocery stores and going out for movies or that type of thing. And I think we're seeing that that's just not the case right now. Construction, I think, in general, if looking back on the numbers earlier this year and some of the commentary, it seemed like they were ready for additional rate cuts. They built more inventory, and then sales were weak. And we've seen 4 months in a row of contraction in the construction industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's camp it on construction there for a little bit, because it just reminded me of something else that I'm looking at here in especially in the commodities report. We've talked in the past. There's this impression that the services sector is somewhat insulated from the impact of tariffs, and as we've discussed in the recent months' reports, that is certainly not the case. And then I'm looking at the commodities up in price. And there are commodities that you would associate more with the manufacturing sector. Aluminum up for the third straight month. Aluminum products, copper, lumber, steel and steel products. I mean, those are commodities that are obviously much more correlated with the manufacturing sector, but it's a big deal in services too, because of construction that you mentioned. Just talk about those are aluminum and steel for sure are typically price drivers when you're talking about inflation. Just talk about how those dynamics affect services maybe a little bit more than people would think.
Sure. In transportation,
Mm-hmm.
would see that from a cost of products, because you're buying those trucks, you're buying equipment for rental equipment, same kind of thing. Those input materials are going into the product costs. Tariffs from a utility standpoint and from a construction standpoint, anything that might be a long lead time item, like a transformer that maybe you have to order 3 years or 2 years out before it gets delivered, you're paying those tariffs now. Paying with the one that no matter what you thought the price was going to be, in many cases you're paying that increased tariff when you're importing it and having it delivered into the U.S. So that has a significant impact there. Steel and lumber were areas where we've seen increased cost, which would drive into construction as well as utilities. And we've seen lumber drop recently, but that's after a couple of months of seeing prices going up. And you'll see kind of across the board, maybe we've had twice as many commodities in the prices up category this month over last. It was a significant increase in the numbers, and so that flows through into everybody's pockets, I think.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about some of the potential alarm bells in the report as we've been discussing here. I took note, and this was something that I wanted to talk to you about. I let you know beforehand. August is kind of in the time that I've been involved, with reporting on the PMI. It's typically a tougher to forecast month for the services sector, because you never know how much vacation spending is going to go down or experience spending is going to taper off as school restarts. So yeah, that always makes it tough. But among the industries that reported contraction in July, 3 of them stood out to me: arts, entertainment, and recreation, accommodation and food services, and construction. those are industries that typically thrive in the summer months, when the weather's good and people have more time to do things. I mean, you've talked about already some of the, challenges that construction has faced in recent months. But, given that, that they contracted in a month that you would expect them to do well, any potential concerns there as we head into the fall?
I would tie that together with the employment contraction, Dan. When you see other people around you that are having difficulty getting jobs, you think about, okay, so what's the risk of me having something happen, or thinking about finding a new role? It just makes you more pessimistic, I think. Our consumer confidence numbers, I think we saw, I don't stay real close to those. I know a couple of months ago we had some very negative reporting in terms of consumer confidence. I don't know whether those have recovered.
The one that I saw in the last couple of days was the University of Michigan one, that it showed it had ticked up a little bit in the previous month, but it was still historically pretty low.
Yeah, I wouldn't have, looking back on the employment numbers, I think those are the ones that we're seeing flowing through, especially last month, where we saw arts as well as accommodations both drop month over month. I think it's just people looking out for their own welfare.
Yeah. Well, I had mentioned employment concerns. Any other industries that are particularly problematic or worrisome, that you saw in the data or in the comments regarding employment, especially, as we go into the fall?
Well, the accommodation and food services one is one that saw the largest or the lowest contractionary number in employment. You got to wonder whether some of the immigration constrictions are having some impact in that industry. I mean, all the writers are saying it did. I don't know to what extent, but certainly you wouldn't be surprised if you heard, you read an article in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times tomorrow saying that employment and accommodation and food services dropped significantly and directly related to either legal or undocumented folks in the industry reducing. When you get pressure around you and negative sentiment around being an immigrant, I think you're probably less likely to come here and less likely to stay here, and that certainly would have an impact there. But also one that's probably obvious is education. It's summertime, so you're going to see a drop in employment in the education field. So that was one of the ones that is probably not much of a surprise.
Yeah, this is a question that I regularly ask you, and when we have time in our broadcast, and I'll frame it in this way because I was just thinking about it. I think it's pretty cool. We have ISM member companies, where there are people in the procurement organization. It's their responsibility to digest the ISM data and pass that along to their CEOs or their C-suites and tell them what they need to know about it. So I think that's pretty cool. But I'll phrase that question to you. I mean, if you were the guy in charge of letting your CEO or your executive team, knowing what they need to know about this month's services data, what are the key takeaways?
Most of us have those commodities or services that we acquire that are difficult to get or have a long lead time associated with them. With the employment numbers being down the way they are and the supplier deliveries getting longer, it kind of gives you a look back to the COVID timeframe where people weren't working. When they started coming back because they could, the ability of suppliers and producers to meet demand was not there because they just had limited capacity. I would be reviewing. There's always enough to serve the first person. the second person, the third person. It's when you're the last quarter of people in line, you're the ones that get screwed because you didn't get in line fast enough. So I would be looking at those where we have some supply constraint, making sure that we get those in our back pocket now, so that when things start to pick up, because there'll be some stimulus which will come around, whether it's a reduction in rate or the actual impact of the tax laws, where there's been some significant reduction in taxes paid and the ability to fully expense capital investments. I think we're going to see a spike, just not the next couple of months. So being ready for that is, I think, an important priority.
Yeah. Well, it's going, yeah, and really looking forward to the August data. I think it will be revealing. Kind of interested to see, that old saying that 1 month does not make a trend.
Yeah.
We'll get to see if that plays out in August. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about when we get together in a month's time. But yeah, Steve, this has been a great discussion. Lots to think about. Anything that I didn't ask or anything that we haven't talked about, whether in the data or in the comments or any other thing related to the report on business data for July that we haven't discussed that you think might be important.
I think the questions were great this month,
Yeah.
Dan. You covered the whole breadth today.
Great, thanks. Well, yeah, we got a couple minutes left, but nothing wrong with giving our viewers a couple more minutes left back in their workday. So yeah, Steve, thanks for joining us. Have a nice rest of your business time there in Vegas, and we will see you in September when we discuss the August data.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for joining us today. And for more information, feel free to go to ismworld.org, where in a little bit you can read our roundup article that discusses a lot of the stuff that Steve and I have discussed here. And if you would like to be a part of the manufacturing, services, or hospital business survey panels that help compile data for the report on business, you can go to ismworld.org/join the panel for more information. And we'll see you back here in a month's time when we break down the manufacturing and services report on business for August. So for Steve Miller and those behind the digital curtain today who helped us behind the scenes, Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens, I'm Dan Zeiger. We'll see you next time.